you have had sight of some really concerning WhatsApp messages, which are being shared amongst doctors and staff on the NHS front line.
It's a group chat between 13,000 doctors who work on the front line and in primary care, and they're sharing their concerns about the NHS, what they see, their experiences. There are thousands of these posts, and I've just picked 3 of them here as examples, and they are very worrying. In our hospital, we have such a long wait to get into the acute medical unit, the admissions unit, that we have a junior doctor on the roster called the car triage.
The car triage?
Car triage. This means they spend their whole shift checking on people waiting outside in their cars. New term.
So hang on, so a doctor specifically assigned to go out to the car park?
Check on people in cars because there's no room in the corridors.
And that's the only thing that they do on their shift?
That's what they do on their shift.
They're in the car park?
Yeah, that's the first one. Second one, new terms that this doctor has learnt this week, reverse boarding. The term used to explain the process of kicking a patient out of a resus cubicle space in emergency care and placing them on a corridor so that a more critical patient can take their place. Today, we did this so a patient could die anywhere other than in the corridor.
Good God.
So they had a patient who was dying...
In the corridor.
Who was in the corridor. They had to remove a patient who was being cared for in a bed because they were in a better state.
Indeed.
So that they could put the dying patient into a bed.
Yeah.
What a decision to have to make.
Absolutely. And here's another one. This is not unusual. Twice this month, I have had patients miss the window for thrombosis and or thrombectomy, which refers to the use of clot-busting drugs to stop brain damage in someone who's had a stroke. We've missed the window, which is 2 hours, because they've been sat in an ambulance in our hospital car park for too long. That's 2 people with life-changing disabilities that could have been prevented. I am heartbroken. And people are saying, for the first time in their careers, they're in tears at the end of their shift. And when they return to the next shift, the same patients are still waiting to be seen after 24 hours. These are just a small sample of what's going on. And for Rishi Sunak and the government to pretend that this is not a crisis when more than a dozen trusts have announced critical incidents is not only delusional, as the BMA say. I would say that at the very best, it's ill-informed misjudgment. At the very worst, it's total irresponsibility and incompetence.
If you were at the press...
I've never known anything like this in
If you were at the press conference today and you sat patiently and listened to the speech about mathematics and the importance of maths in schools up to the age of 18, etc., what would be your first question to the Prime Minister? My
first statement would be that maths is certainly important to the Prime Minister because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 million people are on NHS waiting lists today. And it's only going to get worse. What is he going to do about this? If this isn't a crisis, what is? I've never known the NHS in such a bad situation, and if it doesn't change very quickly, the NHS is finished. And I say that with...
What do you mean?
It can't... It's not sustainable. It's going to collapse. And that means that the very worst off people, the sickest people, will not get the care that we have become used to in the last few decades.
Dr. Hillary, previously we have discussed the problem with calling an ambulance, and you've even recommended that if people can drive or be driven to hospital, that you would suggest they do that. Clearly, that is now the case, because if there is a doctor who is assigned to car triage, there's clearly a queue of cars taking up the time of a doctor. Now, what happens if you are in that car? I mean, because clearly there's some people who are experiencing stroke. So if you're in a cab and you think you're having a stroke, the doctor comes out and says, what? I mean, immediately gets you in and treated?
Yep.
But from what your WhatsApp doctors are saying, they're not able to get the treatment to people quickly enough.
It's an assessment. So what happens with ambulances, what should happen is that the paramedics will have already made a clinical assessment which they hand over to the A&E staff. That's normal procedure. So if people are waiting in cars, they're either fit enough to walk through the doors of A&E, register, sit down in the waiting room and wait, or if they're worse than that, they need to be assessed quickly by somebody, whether it's a car triage doctor on his shift or somebody else.
Oh, just to be clear then.
And then they would be taken straight through to the cubicles.
If you can get out of the car and stagger into A&E, you should. You don't have to sit in your car.
No.
Provided you can get out and get into the building, that's what you should do.
You'd still go into the A&E department, you'd register, and you'd sit and wait until you're triaged in there. But if there's no room in the waiting room, then what alternative do you have to sit in your car and wait?
And what do you make of this story that I think is London Ambulance is saying they will be handing over patients after 45 minutes, whether there are staff there or not.
Sure. They're stuck between a rock and a hard place. They've got people waiting for them to go and call on because they've had an emergency at home or, you know, a life-threatening emergency at home, but they've still got a patient in their ambulance who might require oxygen. So whatever they do, you know, they can't win. Hospitals are running out of oxygen. There are patients on oxygen concentrators because they haven't got cylinders which give a higher concentration of oxygen.
But this is almost
this is really worrying.
This is almost like
the staff.
Your second new terminology, reverse boarding, where you've got staff having to make these terrible critical decisions to move someone who's dying in the corridor into a bed and get the person who needs to be in the bed into the corridor. It's just appalling. This is what ambulance crews in London are now doing. They're basically drawing a line, an artificial line in time, 45 minutes. And after 45 minutes, if the patient's still in the ambulance, they're going to take them out, take them into the corridor, put them there, say, your problem, get back in the ambulance, and then hopefully answer another 999 call.
Absolutely. I know of hospitals where not only have they got trolleys in the corridors, they've run out of trolleys in the corridors and people are on mattresses or sitting on the floor. Now, this is totally unacceptable. This is third world medicine, and we've never known anything like this. And for the government to say we're not in a crisis is, frankly, incompetent.
What would you have thought if, let's say, let's pluck a figure out of the air, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, one of us had read to you these new terminologies, car triage, reverse boarding, stroke doctor. You wouldn't have known what we were talking about.
No.
In other words, the prospect of the NHS declining into this mess wouldn't have even occurred to you that it could get this bad.
It was going that way even before the pandemic. I mean, people were complaining that we were understaffed, under-resourced. Look, we've got 160,000 vacancies in social care. 160,000 in social care, which is why, you know, every hospital in the land has probably got 100 to 200 patients that don't need to be in an acute medical bed. They should be in social care. But if we haven't got the people to look after them in social care, they're stuck in hospitals, and that prevents other people from being admitted to hospital. Now, usually hospitals will phone another hospital and say, we're full, can you take any more patients? And they're saying, no, we're full as well. And that's happening throughout the country.
Meanwhile, everybody should study maths until they're 18 years old, Ed. That's the problem,
Well, that is the problem. I mean, we talked about the NHS yesterday, and no doubt we'll talk about it again on the programme because it is the biggest issue that the country's talking about at the moment. And what I said yesterday is that the NHS has got more funding than it's ever had in its history. And for me, the issue is not about how much money you put in it anymore. It's about how you reform it and how you make it work effectively. Now,
there's a massive gap in staff,
if Dr. Hillary
though,
talks about car triage, no one wants to hear about anything about car triage. But we also know that with GPs, you now tend to talk to your GP on your phone and get advice and help over the phone. So the way people are dealt with changes greatly. We want to see more pharmacies, for example, giving patients the kind of routine care that they used to think they get from their GPs.
Pharmacists are really, really busy themselves. They can't get antibiotics.
I think we should. I mean, there is a huge amount
supply
of positive news going on. I mean, I can wander into my pharmacy, get a COVID jab, get a flu jab, get it all done in 5 minutes. There's a lot of preventative care that is now happening on your high street.
Preventative care, but
he's just had his bloods taken. I mean, the blue blood came out, and you've had lots of diagnosis.
Well, let's not divulge private medical information live on television. Did you want that shared, Kevin?
I'm sure he's going to talk
It was
about
just a routine blood test. Look, GPs are seeing more people than ever. Miracles are performed by incredibly dedicated, professional, skilled and hard-working NHS staff every day. When you talk about the highest funding ever, you cannot get away that the NHS, under 13 years of Tory rule, had the smallest increase in its history. There are more of us now. We're living longer. There are better treatments. People are saved who would have died. It's a complete red herring.
Susanna,
but is the answer when Kevin Maguire becomes health secretary?
You squeeze
is
the
it just
life
to keep
out
writing
of the
bigger
NHS?
and bigger and bigger
you,
checks,
as
or
an
not
MP
address
and a minister,
as the
actually
fundamental
voted for terrible reforms on privatisation and markets that had to be torn up because they were a waste of time.
Ed just then, very, very fundamentally, and you made the same point yesterday, said, yes, the NHS is being funded, but it's spending the money wrongly. Front page of the Telegraph today, columnist Alison Pearson, guest on this programme from time to time, her headline is, anyone could sort out the NHS better than its useless managers. What do you think about that? How much blame would you ascribe to NHS managers, who many people say are oversubscribed and overpaid?
Ed says they've got the money.
Well, look, you know, there has been this revolving door of managers failing and then getting another job in another hospital elsewhere. But on the whole, I think managers do a very good job. That they're juggling so many different things with very little resources.
Are they overpaid? I mean, some of them are earning £300,000 a year.
I'd rather money was spent on the front line, of course. You know, I think that's where the cutting edge of care is. You know, it worries me that they're spending money on jobs which were unheard of 10 years ago. Diversity managers or whatever.
Did you understand the definition of a diversity manager?
No, I don't.
Because I didn't. I read it 3 times.
Hang on. You've got a very diverse workforce. You've got very diverse patients in a very diverse country. So you're basically avoiding problems either culturally, medically, or employment-wise.
There is actually, you know, in this...
And I'm not sure that getting rid of diversity managers is going to solve the NHS.
What has turned into a seminar about the NHS with Dr. Hillary, what is actually where the common ground is actually what Kevin said, which is we are a very different country to what we were in 1948 when the NHS was established, and we need a different model. We need to think hard about it. Now, Kevin will then divert and say, oh, the Tory wants to charge you for a GP visit. That's not true at all, but I do want a different way of spending the money.
Well, you're quite
because
right.
we do not have an NHS that we can simply say, write a bigger cheque every year and problems will be solved. We need to think differently. And Dr. Hillary, I'm sure you think of ways
Well, one of the
we could
problems
do
is
things
the expectations on the NHS are enormous and unrealistic. In 1948, the NHS was created by the socialist government, best thing they ever did for this country, in order to give emergency care, life-saving care to people who couldn't afford care. Before that, it was private doctors looking after those who could afford it only, and other people just died. Now, if we return to that model, then everyone's protected, but we cannot expect the NHS to do everything for everybody.
Okay.
And those people who can't get what they want right now can be quite abusive and aggressive to staff. And we've got photographs on this site of surgeries that have been smashed up by angry, frustrated patients who are just, you know...
At the end of their tether.
At the end of their tether.
All right, Dr. Hillary, thanks very much indeed.